I'm Axel Cushing, Editor-in-Chief at GameLuster, and this is The Score, a weekly digest of news and commentary from GameLuster and around the industry for the week ending September 30th, 2023. French authorities have raided the local offices of NVIDIA on Friday on suspicion of antitrust activities as part of a larger investigation into the cloud computing sector. The Wall Street Journal reports that the French Competition Authority, which published a report that in part stated their efforts quote, to monitor that established players do not hinder the development of smaller or newer players in the cloud computing sector, has expressed concerns given that NVIDIA appears to have captured a significant portion of the market. By some estimates, that portion approaches 90%, which would be an effective monopoly. Moreover, it's going to be an especially thorny issue given that this is currently only being undertaken by French investigators in particular, and not the EU as a whole. We'll have to see what happens in the months ahead. More layoffs again this week, from the speculative to the shocking. Sega's subsidiary, the Creative Assembly, is undergoing a redundancy consultation process which they acknowledge, quote, may result in job losses in the wake of Sega's cancellation of their live service title Hyenas. The studio posted on Twitter, quote, we have always aimed to operate as a people-first studio. That is foundational to our values and culture. While we must go through this incredibly difficult process, we will prioritize supporting our people at every step. End quote. Activision Blizzard laid off 10 people from their Hearthstone team without any prior notice. Kotaku confirmed that the employees had been laid off, with Activision Blizzard stating, quote, organizational changes were made to the Hearthstone team. As a result, a small number of roles have become redundant. We want to thank these employees for their many contributions. Roblox laid off 30 staff members in its talent acquisition department, stating, quote, this action is the result of the reduction in our hiring targets to better align with our growth goals. Given that Roblox is still bleeding cash, it's probably the least destructive move they could make at this point. But the single biggest layoff this week came from Epic Games, of all places. Over 800 employees, roughly 16% of the company's total workforce, and largely in teams which Epic indicated were, quote, outside core development, presumably meaning outside of teams working on Unreal Engine and Fortnite, are being laid off. On top of this, music storefront Bandcamp is being sold to licensing platform Songtradr, divesting another 250 employees, while youth marketing company Super Awesome is being spun off into its own company 3 years after Epic bought them up. In a letter to affected and remaining employees, CEO Tim Sweeney explained the cause of these moves. For a while now, we've been spending way more money than we earn, investing in the next evolution of Epic and growing Fortnite as a metaverse-inspired ecosystem for creators, he wrote. I had long been optimistic that we could power through this transition without layoffs, but in retrospect I see that was unrealistic. Despite this, Epic isn't just giving the affected employees a pink slip in a box. Those who are being laid off will receive 6 months severance pay, along with a 6-month extension of their health benefits for those in the US, Canada, and Brazil. Additionally, stock option vesting and 401k profit-sharing vesting is also being moved up. While I'm no fan of the metaverse grift in general, it would seem that Sweeney is at least trying to cushion a significant blow in an already deeply unsettled job market, which a lot of his contemporaries likely wouldn't do. One section of Epic Games untouched by their workforce reduction appears to be their legal department, as Epic has once again filed an appeal with the US Supreme Court, with Apple matching their efforts a day later. GamesBeat is reporting that Epic has asked the court to rule on whether, quote, both pro- and anti-competitive effects is unlawful if a less restrictive alternative will achieve the same benefits while harming competition less. More specifically, Epic wants to know if a, quote, less restrictive alternative inherently means that alternative does not cost Apple anything to implement, such as the App Store's 30% cut. Meanwhile, Apple made their own filing to the Supreme Court regarding a ruling from the Ninth Circuit. That filing challenges the ruling that while Apple didn't violate federal antitrust laws, they did violate California anti-steering laws. The filing states, quote, unless corrected by this court, the ruling would render universal injunctions the default remedy in single plaintiff cases, challenging a generally applicable policy. Epic's filing has all the makings of a vendetta, while Apple's filing reeks of Silicon Valley entitlement and lack of self-awareness. Both need to take a good look at their behaviors and just call it a day. I'd really like Apple versus Epic to avoid becoming the new multi-decade case of the tech industry. While various companies are laying off talent in job lots, it would seem some are having trouble holding on to names in the C-suite as well, and the names aren't low-profile unknowns. Hideki Kamiya, the creator of Bayonetta, Viewtiful Joe, and The Wonderful 101, recently announced he'll be leaving his position as Vice President of Platinum Games as of October 12th. In a Twitter post, he wrote, quote, this came after a lot of consideration based on my own beliefs and was by no means an easy decision to make. However, I feel this outcome is for the best. I will continue to create in my Hideki Kamiya way, I hope you'll keep your eyes peeled. Kamiya, along with refugees from Capcom's Clover studio such as Shinji Mikami, co-founded Platinum Games in 2006. In 2020, they opened up a new studio to create follow-ups to Beautiful Joe and The Wonderful 101, with Kamiya as the director. Platinum Games wrote their own post on Twitter about Kamiya's departure. We are truly grateful for his creative ideas, leadership, and contribution to the growth of the studio from our startup to this very day, the post stated. We believe that he will continue to succeed in his future endeavors as a game creator. We are looking forward to seeing the game industry grow into a better place with him in it. We wish him all the best for the future. Gamers might be disappointed, but if Kamiya sticks to his word, we won't be having to wait long for something new and interesting. Meanwhile, the other bombshell departure this week was PlayStation CEO Jim Ryan, who will be retiring next March. Ryan has worked with Sony Interactive Entertainment in one capacity or another for 30 years. In a statement, he wrote, quote, "After 30 years, I have made the decision to retire from SIE in March 2024. I relish the opportunity to have a job I love in a very special company, working with great people and incredible partners. But I found it increasingly difficult to reconcile living in Europe and working in North America. I will leave having been privileged to work on products that have touched millions of lives across the world. PlayStation will always be part of my life, and I feel more optimistic than ever about the future of SIE. I want to thank Yoshida-san for placing so much trust in me and being an incredibly sensitive and supportive leader." Sony CEO Kenichiro Yoshida reciprocated, saying, quote, "Jim Ryan has been an inspirational leader throughout his entire period with us, but never more so than in overseeing the launch of PlayStation 5 in the midst of the global COVID pandemic. That extraordinary achievement made by the entire SIE team has been steadily built upon, and PlayStation 5 is on track to become SIE's most successful console yet. I am immensely grateful to Jim for all his achievements." While Ryan officially leaves next year, his position will be filled in the interim by Sony Group Corporation President, COO, and CFO Hiroki Totoki. It's hard to muster a lot of goodwill towards one of the suits, and Jim Ryan's departure is going to be one of those events that will likely have far-reaching consequences for the games industry as a whole, and PlayStation in particular. That said, the man's done his bit. He spent 3 decades at one company in an industry where CEOs last only slightly less long than a sitting US president on average, and he's earned himself a new chapter in his life. In a somewhat related vein, a company which hasn't been able to keep a CEO longer than a year is getting a new one. Ryan Cohen, former CEO of pet food website Chewy, has been named CEO of GameStop. Cohen previously held a seat on the board of directors starting in 2021 after taking a stake in GameStop the year before. Curiously, in making the announcement of Cohen's assumption to the position, GameStop indicated he will not be receiving any compensation for the role. While Cohen has taken steps to undo some of the more poorly conceived plans from the retailer, such as getting out of the crypto and NFT space, there's still a great deal of uncertainty about where exactly he plans to take the company. Previous statements from Cohen have mentioned wanting to pivot away from brick and mortar and towards a, quote, technology-driven vision. How exactly he plans to do that, and what that will actually mean for customers as well as GameStop, remains to be seen. The FTC has submitted a new court filing in their ongoing and increasingly chaotic efforts to block the Microsoft-Activision merger. The filing states, quote, "The Commission has determined that the public interest warrants that this matter be resolved fully and expeditiously." An expansively ironic statement given the amount of foot-dragging and ham-fisted lawyering which has occurred in this matter. The FTC's filing also gave a time frame for the evidentiary hearing which they postponed by taking the matter out of the in-house adjudication process back in August. The evidentiary hearing in this proceeding shall commence 21 days after the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit issues its opinion regarding the appeal of the District Court decision on the requested preliminary injunction. So it could be Monday morning, or it could be a year from now. Microsoft, for its part, indicated that they're unconcerned by this latest move, with a spokesperson saying, quote, "We still anticipate that we will close the transaction by October 18th, and we have full confidence in our case and the deal's benefits to gamers and competition." It is theoretically possible that FTC Commissioner Lena Khan suddenly remembered that she's working for the good of the American consumer as a whole and not trying to score points with Sony for some weird reason. If they can put together a collection of evidence that actually supports their assertion that the merger is not in the interest of the American consumer, well and good. But at this point, they have put themselves behind the 8 ball. They literally cannot stop the merger prior to its October 18th closing date. It's unlikely they're going to get the Ninth Circuit to issue any emergency injunctions, and they're not going to get the Supreme Court to back their play. It's not impossible that the FTC, and by extension the federal government, could mandate a breakup or significant divestiture of studios which have been acquired by Microsoft after the merger is completed, something along the lines of the baby bells which came about from the breakup of AT&T. On the other hand, given how they bungled what should have been a tough but arguable case, I'm not holding out a lot of hope they'll actually put their brains in gear on this matter. Finally this week, a pair of events have occurred which on their own wouldn't occasion much comment. Looked at together, however, they paint a stark and somewhat disturbing picture about the current trajectory on the future of the industry. On the one hand, you have Ubisoft CEO Yves Guillemot proclaiming all the wonderful things that are going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years with the assumed rise of cloud gaming. On the other, you have Fortune columnist Paul Tassi wondering if the live services bubble has finally burst, a question occasioned by the near 2-week DDoS incident which plagued Bungie and their Destiny 2 servers recently. Guillemot's statement is predictable in its wide-eyed and wildly unrealistic assumptions. I think what's more painful is that this is literally the last person who should be singing the praises of cloud gaming and game streaming, given how badly Ubisoft got burned by Google with Gods and Monsters. I understand a CEO should be projecting confidence in his company and all, but there's a point where projecting confidence all too closely resembles self-delusion. I'm kind of thinking Guillemot has gone well beyond that point. His emphatic comparison to Netflix is not only disingenuous, but almost literally an apples to oranges situation. Netflix streaming movies, by and large, is a one-way stream punctuated by the occasional upstream command to stop, pause, fast forward, or rewind. Video games are putting a lot more information upstream, and they're doing so almost constantly. But it's the cloud! I can almost hear somebody screaming. Yeah, the cloud. I will continue to contend that anybody blithering about the virtues of the cloud doesn't understand the first thing about it. There's suckers who bought tickets to a flea circus and somehow decided that it was worth coming back to over and over again. It's an impressive bit of software engineering, I'll be the first to admit that much. But fundamentally, it's a clever parlor trick. Whatever the configuration of the virtual machines, there's physical infrastructure supporting it. And that infrastructure is vulnerable to attack by bad actors on the individual and nation-state level, not to mention data security and privacy issues involved by the people who notionally run these services. If you want to catch a glimpse of the real future of cloud gaming, the last 2 weeks or so in the Destiny community would be a signal example. Players were experiencing a rash of connectivity issues, causing significant discontent among the player base for the interruptions and their impact on various activities. Bungie announced to their community that the servers appeared to be experiencing a distributed denial-of-service attack, and that they were trying to deal with the problem. It was a rare acknowledgement of a significant issue, one which at least soothed some of the raw nerves of a player base which was already borderline mutinous owing to previous disruptions which appeared to originate from Bungie. Still, there were a lot of very irritated players, and justifiably so. It was this incident, combined with the cancellations of Hyenas and the Epic Games layoffs, which likely spurred Tassi to contemplate the state of the live service sector and its future. In a recent video, he points out one of the biggest challenges of live service games, delivering a steady stream of PvE content on a regular basis. Yet I think he's overlooking the more fundamental challenges, the things players don't really think about until something in the back end breaks, much like it did with Destiny 2. Whether it's shambolic code bases, technical debt, or network vulnerabilities, a live service game is never going to escape its own destruction. It's literally fighting the forces of entropy, and losing that fight on a regular basis. MMORPGs like World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV suffer a lot of the same problems, though their expansions aren't quite as numerous. Live service games, on the other hand, have imposed a ridiculous, bastardized mashup of sports season and television season on themselves in the mistaken belief that they can control the flow of content. Everything is done in the service not of good storytelling or good gameplay, but in the unholy and nebulous metric of engagement. The premise reads like bad cyberpunk. Keep those players addicted to their virtual crack and we'll make money. Only it's unsettlingly real. The problem is that sooner or later these games will have to come to an end. Whether through narrative exhaustion or logistical constraints, they're going to reach a point where they're no longer viable, either as individual titles or an industry sector. The studios will undoubtedly refuse to recognize this, citing the engagement numbers as proof that they're still making money and their games are relevant. Consider World of Warcraft. Early expansions such as the Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King were some of the most involved and exciting add-ons to an MMO ever produced. By comparison, more recent expansions like Shadowlands and Battle for Azeroth have suffered from a sense of narrative bloat and needless complications. At some point, you have to declare a story is over and start working on the sequel. I would argue Bungie kind of screwed up when they released Destiny 2 when they did, creating a sequel when they hadn't actually completed the narrative arc they'd begun with Destiny. On the other hand, they screwed up so many other elements with Destiny, both narratively and mechanically, it's hard to see how they could have corrected without something similar to the current system evolving over time. It still would have been a bad idea, but it would have come about perhaps in a slightly different fashion. Unfortunately, what game studios and publishers can't seem to get into their heads is that nothing lasts forever, or rather, it doesn't last forever on their terms. Live service games are not only a grotesque effort at monetizing player activity and data-driven player surveillance, but they're also a crude attempt to create a theme park, a walled garden with a captive audience. I can guarantee you that 10 years down the road or so, you won't see Destiny or The Division appearing on GOG.com as part of their good old games section, because there is no provision for them to be anything but live service, a half-measure MMO that will disappear into the ether once the developer or publisher decides that it's no longer worth running. And that too will inevitably come about, because sooner or later, one of two things will happen. One, the publisher is going to run the numbers and they'll come to the conclusion that money spent isn't worth the money coming in. That server costs, overtime for developers rushing to keep an increasingly ramshackle code base from self-destructing, and dealing with security concerns is eating too far into profits. Or two, players are going to decide they've had enough. They will decide that the story is too stale, or worse, that it's just gone someplace completely unrelatable. Or they'll decide that blowing $100 a year on the same game that expects them to spend more money on top of that entry fee for shiny things they won't be able to show off outside of the game is just too much of an ask anymore. For all their pious claims of listening to the community, live service games don't look at players as players. They look at them as marks, as piggy banks to break open and plunder at will. Perhaps that's part of the reason we saw those DDoS attacks. Sure, it could be for the lulz. Sure, it might have been an effort to extort money out of Bungie. But suppose the next time isn't for either one of those things. Next time, it's a backlash against the entire concept of live service games, of cloud streaming, of every single step developers and publishers take to try and lock up their games against the very people they claim they want to have play them. I've come to believe that cloud gaming, in addition to being a small variation on the parlor trick of cloud computing, is simply another expression of games industry confirmation bias. Studios have access to tremendous amounts of computing power and ridiculously fat internet pipes. Therefore, everybody else does as well, which isn't the truth at all. Cloud gaming offers only the promise of high-quality experiences for those who have the bandwidth, for those who are willing to offload everything needed to make the games work onto the publishers and pay them for the privilege. It will be the equivalent of holding up a giant sign saying, "Shoot me right here and now." Because live service games are vulnerable to DDoS attacks, cloud gaming will be vulnerable to DDoS attacks. Same underlying premise, same technical vulnerabilities, and ultimately the same shocked expressions on CEO faces when the house of cards gets obliterated by the low-orbit ion cannon. The only difference will be the names of everybody involved. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe. You can find other news articles along with guides, reviews, and features on our website, GameLuster.com. The opening music for the score was written and performed by Nirav Gandhi. I'm Axel Cushing, Editor-in-Chief at GameLuster, and this has been The Score. Thank you for listening.